Already. Right? It's February 1 today?
Good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about tax increment financing. Jim Gilmore has been working on this the last couple of months, so we're looking forward to your information today, Jim. So it's your floor.
Okay, thank you. There's kind of three parts to this presentation I want to go over. One, just some basic information on how tax increment financing works. I'll use the Roberts example for that. Secondly, a report on the status of the different TIF districts that we have in place. And then finally, I'd like to get some input from you on this proposal for a riverfront TIF. I mentioned it at the City Commission meeting, I think in September, and I actually have a draft plan done. But I think it's important to get your thoughts on what should be in the plan, what shouldn't be in the plan. First of all, we'll use the Roberts example to show how the process of tax increment financing works in this particular example, the Roberts garage. The first step is that you come up with a plan for renewal. This was the TIF district that was approved in 2015. At that point, it was all vacant parking lots. So one of the goals that the city had was a need for housing as well as more parking downtown. So you put together a renewal plan. This is a kind of a bird's eye view of that site. You can kind of see it was all surface parking lot, not a lot of activity. In some ways, it was a bit of a dead zone between Broadway and the courthouse. The city had been planning for years, trying to figure out how to provide some money for an additional parking facility, identify sites. And so the city had been increasing the fees and getting bonds paid on the Island Park ramp. This is the property taxes that were available from that property in 2015. Of course, the city-owned lots weren't paying any property taxes. The private parking lots were paying a total of $2,100 a year in property taxes, and the city share of that was $367. One of the ideas for a mixed-use parking ramp came from a trip we took to Lincoln, Nebraska. I think it was in the fall of 2014. I know some of you were on that trip, and this was in downtown Lincoln called Park House. It had a main floor commercial. There were housing on the top and then parking within the structure. And so the idea was when we came back here, are there sites within Fargo where we could have this type of a mixed-use development? We adopted a renewal plan. We looked at this particular site with Roberts. There was we had a consultant look at how could we fit parking facilities in different areas of the downtown and also have private development. So the step two, we built the parking garage. We actually put on an RFP. We had three proposals from groups to develop not only the parking lot ramp, but also mixed-use development. We selected Kilbourne Group as the developer. The parking garage cost was about $13 million. We'd issued $10 million in GO bonds to be paid for from the parking fund. And at that point, we had about $3 million balance in the various parking funds. Step three along the way, after the parking was there, then the private development followed. They really couldn't do the private development without parking being adjacent. And so the first phase was Roberts building that was part of that agreement. Not part of that agreement, but part of the TIF plan was the Dillard building. That site became available actually, sooner than we thought it might, and that was built next. And now we have Kessler, the third part that was part of the development agreement was to develop at least the north part of that site. The new development that's come in has been the Roberts building, valued at $11 million at the private side of it. Dillard valued at $16.8 million, and Kessler, the north side of that's in the TIF district, is going to be estimated at $9.7 million. So then the development comes. The new property taxes above what was being paid before is estimated that it'll be $499,000 a year once the buildings are completed and the Renaissance zone exemptions expire. In the short term, we've used other parking net operating income to pay the debt. And so starting in 2026, there would be the income from operations, and the TIF income would more than pay the annual debt. And then there'd be additional money available, and that's going towards the mercantile project. So in step 5 in 2036, the TIF district can expire. At that point, the property tax would be $499,000 a year, city share of roughly $90,000. So the benefits of this, of course, are eliminated those blighted parking lots over there. We have 454 garage spaces where we simply had less than half of that surface space before. There are 11 new businesses, more active downtown, 265 housing units. The building permit revenue on all of these developments has been $272,000 over the last 5 years. And then, of course, there's that long-term property tax increase. And here's some photos of the different buildings where there's Roberts, the front there. It's really kind of helped bring more people downtown, activated that alley. There's a restaurant on the main floor. I think the one in Lincoln had a Chipotle. We have 46 Pints. There's the Dillard building. In front of that, this is a view of one of the apartments on one of the upper floors. Kind of a nice view to the north and the west, as well as another restaurant in the alley. The picture of the Kessler taken recently shows you that's under construction, and this is an image of what the front of that would look like. And so the key to this tax increment financing district was getting started, putting that public investment up front, building the parking garage. The development followed, the money from the new development, then along with the parking income from the ramp paid for that development. And in the long term, 15 years from now, this would all be paying property taxes to the school district, the city, as well as all the great economic activity that we didn't have there before. So I'll move on now to the report on the status of all our tax increment financing districts. These are some of the closed out TIF districts. I want to point out that especially the C2 Radisson district, I've had, I think, 4 people in the last year express concern to me that TIF district was still active, and actually it closed out 14 years ago. But sometimes I think these get a lot of publicity when they start, and they don't get any publicity when they end. So the Radisson is one that closed in 2007. Some that have closed out in recent years been, of course, out by Anderson Field. That was a large TIF district. The Dakota Bank one that was quite an older district where we funded the Island Park ramp closed out last year, and the Roars Stop and Go one closed out also last year. That one closed out a few years ahead of schedule. So you can see the value of the increment that we didn't have before these just TIF districts added up to $321 million. We have 2 types of TIF districts that we use in terms of how we pay for things. One is where the city goes out, either borrows the money or uses internal money to fund it. Whenever we're doing that, there's going to be some risk involved, and so we typically would have a backup special assessment district or some sort of security agreement. The other is a developer where there's a TIF note. In these cases, there's no risk because we've promised to pay the developer money from the TIF, or we promised to pay the developer back with future TIF revenue. If there's no revenue, they don't get any thing for their note. If there is revenue, then their note is paid off. So it's not low risk, it's actually zero risk. These are the 10 TIF notes that we have right now. You kind of see the annual revenue in each one. We've used TIF for just a whole wide variety of things. There's been new housing. The Butler Business Park was an industrial site. So a lot of them are housing, some of them are commercial. So they can be used really for a variety of things. And our TIF policy kind of sets out different objectives. There's objectives when it's commercial, there's objectives when it's mixed use, and there's objectives when it's housing. And so we kind of rate those based on that. So the Roars one you'll see there, that one hasn't started. There'll be TIF revenue next year on that one. The Shotwell Commons and the 914 Weston, which is the old McDonald's in North Broadway, if you've been in Fargo for a long time. Those are actually closing out this year, and they may have actually closed out already as the property taxes were paid. And so those would not be on the list next year. This is just some examples of how they worked. We pay the developer back an agreed upon amount of money with this, again, the old McDonald's site on 32nd Avenue North and Broadway. We had projected that there'd be a $1.8 million increase in property values. It was actually higher than that, it was at $2.4 million. The increase in property taxes was at $33,000, a little bit above projected, even with the lower mill levy. And we anticipated that it would take 10 years to pay off that TIF note. It actually is paid off. It's not being paid off after 8 years, and because of the higher revenue than expected. So this one's will be closed out. Another was the former Shotwell greenhouses on 13th Avenue North. We had projected a $4.9 million increase. It turned out to be $6.2 million. The increase in property taxes wasn't as high as expected because the mill levy went down. And so this has taken one more year than expected to pay off, 8 years versus 7 years. The city bonds, there's 6 of these now that are active. Phelan Properties was an industrial park north of the city landfill. This one is closing out this year. TIF revenue of $700,000 being used to pay off some costs for 12th Avenue North. The value of that increment is $62 million. So again, next year, this is projected that the TIF district would end, and that $700,000 in revenue would be distributed amongst the local property taxing districts. The Forest Park, that's one that's taking longer than projected. The development came slower, but we're starting to make some progress in paying off those costs. The next 3 are ones that were approved more recently. The Roberts parking, what I talked about, Block 9, and the Mercantile parking. In no revenue this year, that revenue will come in next year based on the value of the buildings. And the value of the buildings is set as of February 1st, so Mike today will be running around all these buildings to see how far they are along in construction, or at least sometime this week.
Jim, can I ask a clarifying
Sure.
question? Value of increment, is that in property value, or what's the increment?
The increment is the increase in property value. So it's valued at $62 million more than the base value, whatever that was. If we look in the annual report, we can see what that was. So, and the revenue is the TIF revenue paid on that particular increment amount. So I wanted to talk to you about trying to the concept. Maybe any questions on TIF in general or that report? No. So when we look at the riverfront, this was a city approved a downtown plan a few years ago, and this was the future land use plan along the river, concept for residential, mixed use, commercial, public institutional to be developed along the river. There's some I think quite a bit of redevelopment potential along the river. I think if you look at the amount of private sector housing along the river that's East of 4th Street, we have the condos north of here, I think 40 units there. There's a few units down by Prairie St. John's. Other than that, there's very little housing. There's certainly housing going up in the Gateway project. It's just under construction now. The Housing Authority has 2 sites within the area, but we're trying to bring more housing downtown. This is an area where there's very little housing. There has been a lot of interest in developing housing. We've seen housing going up, and so I think there are probably some opportunities in the short term for housing development along the river. And so if we look at redevelopment potential, and there's a couple different things that I'll have in this renewal plan for the city to do. One is spending money on certain public improvements or adding incentives, but also looking at reusing city property for private development that wouldn't generate TIF income. We look north of here, along the river, there's a warehouse that the school district used to own. The diversion authority purchased it so that they could put a levee adjacent to the property, took down a portion of the building. There's still a corner of the building that's too close to be closer to the river than it should be. It's just used as a warehouse now. We store cars in it, and the city vehicles are stored there in the winter. So there's an opportunity to, sell that property, request proposals to redevelop that property. South of there is a former military processing center, privately owned. There's been some interest in developing that, but it's also listed for sale, so possibly we could work with that developer to provide some incentives to get housing on that site. The Fargo Housing Authority has some buildings there, housing. They're not in the best shape, so there's some redevelopment potential there. West of that, Commissioner Prepcorn owns a property, and American Federal has a property that's one is more warehouse type use, the other is surface parking, and then the city has the former health department building that is currently vacant. We lease out some parking spots. So if we can get development going on these projects, you would have more tax base, more activity, more development along the river. Further south of there, there's private property just south of the city hall parking lot. That property is listed for sale. Again, about half of it's surface parking, very low usage. There's a laundry. I don't know if that's really available for development, but it's a type of use that probably wouldn't stay in the downtown forever. And then we have the Mid-America Steel site that we acquired. You see the dotted line through there. Our current flood policy says you can only build west of that line, but in talking to engineering, that's something we should probably take a look at. That was designed more for residential housing than it was for downtown commercial. And actually, as I stand right here, I'm closer to the river than that particular line. And so we built close to the river ourselves, so we should take a look at adjusting that line. South of that, there's private property along Main Avenue with potential for development. The city owns the site of the former Park East apartment, or Park East, I think it was a Park East apartment building. There's a lot of interest in developing that for housing, view of the river. The private property is undergoing redevelopment now, the Gateway redevelopment. And then the Fargo Housing Authority in the process of moving people out of the high rise and trying to look at how to redevelop that property. And in south, we have Prairie St. John's are planning to build a new facility there. They've got quite a bit of parking south of there, so I think there's some potential for redevelopment south of there. I haven't talked to them extensively about that, but there's just another opportunity for redevelopment. So, what are some of the activities? I'm going to pass out a, so we'd like to get your thoughts on, or see if you have any discussion on what kind of things do you want to do with this plan? And it boils down to kind of two things we'd like to spend money on to improve the area. And I've just put together this draft, and there's some things in here you might say we shouldn't be using TIF money for that. There's some things in here on disposing of property. You may think that the city should keep the property. I should note that two of the properties, the old school warehouse and the Park East property, is encumbered by essentially a lien from the diversion district. Well, it's in the city's name and we get to pay the special assessments each year. We actually have to get permission from the diversion authority to sell that property. So here's my thoughts on things that we could do right away in this year. First of all, sell that 1 2nd Street South. That's the property by the high rise for development. That would get some development going there, as well as provide future TIF revenue. Secondly, the warehouse, the old school district warehouse on the north side, to sell that. One option, there's a portion of the building that shouldn't stay there, and so one TIF activity could be to pay for the demolition of that building prior to the sale, essentially turning it into more of a greenfield site. So you could do, city could do that, or you could sell it to a developer with the condition that they tear it down and reuse it. Thirdly, the old public health building that's currently vacant. Certainly there's some interest in that site, and also then begin planning for the Mid-America Steel site. Engineering is trying to figure out where the flood protection should go through that site. That has not yet been identified, and clearly that needs to be decided first prior to selling the balance of the property. So within this plan, I'm laying out different activities that could be done, this coming year, and other things that can be done later. And so I'll give you a draft as you leave, and then we can talk about this at a future meeting, which things should stay in, which things should stay out. Next year, I suggest we partially demolish the Mid-America Steel site. There's a lot of buildings there that really don't have any potential for use. They don't really have any historic character, which is most of the site. And again, trying to create a site that will be attractive for developers. We could borrow money, tear down buildings, then pay ourselves back with future TIF revenue from future income on the property. Secondly, the Fargo Housing Authority, try to do some partnerships with them to redevelop the high-rise property. That's going to be a very challenging site because I don't think it's going to be feasible to reuse the building. And it's going to be very expensive to take down a building that size. But I don't think any of us want to see a 20-some story building just remain there whose sole purpose is to have radio antennas on top. And then finally, the development for private sites. A lot of these developments are simply not feasible without some development incentives. And so the willingness to provide those can lead to redevelopment, just like it did over on Roberts. Further down the road, we could implement some affordable housing projects, either with land. Mid-America Steel site will need some infrastructure. There's, again, there needs to be flood protection put into that site. The underground and condition of NP Avenue that goes by it is both the underground's quite old and needs to be replaced. Street needs work too. And then also you could do some activities here on the Civic Center site that would, I think, encourage other development up and down the river. Pedestrian bridge over 2nd Street's been talked about, performing arts centers, civic plaza, skyway connections, civic parking ramp expansion. There's a variety of different things that could be done. Beyond that could be additional infrastructure redevelopment activities. If you create a riverfront TIF like this, the maximum number of years is 25. That's a cap at state law. But you don't get any money until things get started. This is just an idea to show you how, when revenue could actually come in. If a project was approved this spring, construction starts in the fall, it's complete maybe by the end of December, February 1st of 2023, Mike goes out, sets a value on it, property tax bill gets sent out at the end of the year, and then so 2024 would be the earliest you'd see TIF revenue, if we start today. And so the sooner you start, the sooner you'd actually have resources available to do some of these activities. As far as what's value, the TIF income, if we get something going, this year, potentially you could see an income stream of $500,000 by the year, starting the year 2024, assuming some projects start this year. Down the road, it could be much more than that, assuming that we would get $120 million in development done over the next, 5 to 8 years. It's really hard to, I guess I view this downtown riverfront TIF as an additional tool for redevelopment. We have the Renaissance Zone that covers most of the area. It's in an opportunity zone, so there's some tools already in place, but having a TIF district that could make public improvements and provide some additional development incentives, I think would encourage and spur development along the river. Some of these things, I wouldn't go out and borrow money today based on knowing for sure their development's going to happen. You need to kind of, probably move along a little bit gradually and cautiously at first. But then later there's an opportunity to build on that momentum, just as we've seen over on Robert Street as that development and momentum built into not only the Roberts development, but the Mercantile. So, any questions or thoughts? Gone through this a little fast.
Commissioner Pepcorn?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thanks, Jim. That was excellent, and it's to me very exciting. This is, I think this will set the tone for this area for the next 50 to 100 years, so long after we're gone. So I'm really looking forward to it. And my main thing is I think we need to proceed with caution. And when you talk about selling any of this, I would not be in favor of selling any property that the city has right now. The main thing we've learned is you want to for sure have it be an RFP, so we know exactly what's going to be there instead of selling it and hoping for the best. I would encourage us to use RFPs because that gives the city a lot more control over what happens. And I do think we have lots of assets there and how we deploy them. When you talk about TIFs, like you said, it's a very important tool, and I think we've been fairly well disciplined with how we use the tool, and I think we need to be very careful in the future. But this development in the downtown, this is hugely important, and it's going to set the tone for our city, so it's a great time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Gregg?
What's our current TIF debt today?
If I can go back here. The notes, I don't have that info, but again, they're only payable if the money comes in, so it's more of a pay-as-you-go. The Great Northern Depot, I think it's about 30,000. The Horse Park is close to $1 million. Roberts parking ramp, I think we've paid down that to about $8.5 million. Mercantile parking was about $13 million we borrowed on that. the block 9, I think it's 15 million. That was the cap on that, and they're paying that back. We have security on that. So,
So tens of millions of dollars,
pardon me?
tens of millions of dollars, right?
Yes.
So I'd say we are less disciplined. I'd be less excited to do more of this. This is debt. When you say there's zero risk, well, in the early 2000s or late 90s, we built a parking ramp where US Bank was, and after 15 years it failed. So we had a loan that we gave out. It was paid off, but then the next day basically it had to be removed. So someone had to pay for that to be removed, and I think that was us. So there is a risk to this. And let's say a company comes, gets a TIF, and they build it, and the ramp goes the wrong way, and they go out of business. It has to be removed, and we're on the hook for that. So it's not zero risk. There's a lot of risk. When you have debt, there's risk. How much money does the parking ramps currently make? Do we make money on the parking ramps?
We make money in operation. So for instance, our net operating income this year was around 750,000.
Right, but what's the debt? We don't net
About the
anything.
debt.
That's the gross. What's the net? We net about 300,000 in the hole for each one of those parking ramps, if I remember correctly. So for the next 15, 20 years, we're losing money on these things because we have debt service, and the amount we're giving in parking fees doesn't cover it, and the TIF doesn't cover it. And when the TIF comes off, the parking ramp fees still won't cover the debt. So yeah, in 20 years, maybe 25 years, we're making a profit, but at that point, the parking ramps require maintenance. And we don't know what that debt's gonna be for that. We don't know if they're gonna be crumbled like the R1 in the late 90s or early 2000s was. So that's a problem, and that's not zero risk. That's a debt that we have, and we don't know what's gonna be in the future. It's a lot of money being lost. What's the ROI on that? So if you're an investor, and I say the ROI for you is 25 years to make 0%, and then on year 21, you'll make 8%. There's no investor in this room that would say, that's a great deal, put my money in. But that's what we're asking the city of Fargo to do. So again, there's a lot of risk here. This is not risk-free. The horse park's a great example of that. We made a dime off that. We're in a whole lot for that. Some of these won't pay off for 40 years. What's the oldest TIF in Fargo?
Probably the Great Northern Depot right now, and that should be done in 2 years. The horse park was about,
What about the Island Park ramp?
that one went 40 years.
40 years. I'm 37 years old. If you'd have told me right now, Tony, you're 37, in 40 years, the city of Fargo will start making money on that investment. No thanks. No investor in this room would take that bet. And we were going to extend that further. We were thinking about taking that further until someone spoke up. So 40 years is a very long time to say to the investors, you'll make $0 until that point. And by the way, $0, that's the school board, that's the park board, that's the county, that's vector control, that's the airport, and that's the greater city of Fargo. And Jim, I'm not beating you up. You're in a tough position. You were asked to put this together, and now you're the mouthpiece. So I'm not beating you up. I'm talking to the commissioners. I'm talking to the audience here, saying 40 years is an absurd amount of time for the taxpayers to get their money to zero. In fact, in 40 years, it wouldn't even be zero. They'll be negative because they had to pay up front for that with interest. So in 50 years, they might make a profit. 50 years, good Lord. If I'm 87 years old when I start making a profit, no thanks. That's a bad investment for the city of Fargo. There's three big assumptions here with TIFs. One, that nothing would be built in place of these things without the TIF for 25, 40, 50 years, because that's the ROI, 50 plus years, right? Two, that the TIF will end at some point. In Bismarck, they don't end. They have a TIF around their downtown, just like we want to do, and their TIFs are forever. There's never an end point for those. And I would challenge, that's not even legal, but they've been doing it since I've been alive, okay? Hold on, Jim. Three is that the incentive is what made that thing happen. I'm telling you right now, Kmart will be built out without an incentive. It's prime real estate, 12 acres in the middle of Fargo with 30,000 cars driving by a day, and they can build wherever they want there. It's basically a blank slate. Yeah, it's $3 million to clear the area. Good Lord. That's less than it costs for many places in downtown Fargo to be cleared off. And you need a 15-year incentive for that? You're out of your minds. That's not true. Someone will build there. And whether that's investments of $30 million, 50, or 60, the ROI for the people of Fargo is decades better than if you give an incentive for that to be built then. Because we're in the hole immediately, and that's a loan that we have to pay back. And if it fails, who's on the hook? It's not the bankrupt developer that did that, or construction company, it's the people of Fargo. We're in the hole for that. I already talked about zero risk. That's nonsense. If we sell the land southeast of the city of Fargo here, Dave, I disagree completely. I believe in the free market. I believe that government control is far worse than the free market. If we sell that land to a developer, whether it's one of the big ones in Fargo or someone that comes in, they're going to put a mixed-use, beautiful building in there because it's prime real estate on the river. They're going to put a big old apartment complex with entertainment on the bottom, and maybe on top they'll put some sort of art venue. Who knows? But we don't have to control that. That's completely ridiculous. When everyone here bought their companies, they didn't ask the government, hey, can I build this? That's completely un-American in my mind. So we have to ask the government to build on the most valuable land in North Dakota without oil underneath it. That's absurd. It's the most valuable land in North Dakota. The Mid-America Steel property, that is the most valuable land in North Dakota without an oil reserve. And that's a fact. And you need an incentive to develop that? No, you don't. You do not. And no one can convince me otherwise.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm not done yet. I'm extremely unexcited for these. We take on a ton of debt. We assume out of the gate that no one would build without an incentive, which is completely untrue. 99% of the people who stand at that podium and I ask them, would you build without the incentive, say, yes, I would. And we vote 4-1 or 3-2 on a regular basis. We subsidize apartments. We subsidize retail. We subsidize office space, which are all these things we said we wouldn't subsidize with incentives. We wanted a downtown that was the entertainment district. That's what we went out to do. We wanted to incentivize things that the primary market, right, that had a lot of jobs associated with it, with high-paying, baselines. But we have strayed from what we intended to do, and now we've gotten to this point where we are shelling out tens of millions of dollars and saying that this is for the good of the people of Fargo. I call nonsense. No one's property taxes have reduced in the last 25 or 40 years. No one's. And that's what we told people would happen if we let these things happen. If the government invests, someday you'll pay less because more people pay more taxes. Well, that's just not true. And by the way, when the city of Fargo steals from the schools and the park board and the county, they raise their taxes. And so do we, because we're not putting the money where it was intended to be. We're putting it into these TIFs, these little boxes. We're spending money there and saying, what a great job the government did. Let's put our name on the side of that. And by the way, I was critical of building this building so close to the river. And to be flippant about it is upsetting to me. We will allow the city to grow and the city to develop next to the river, but we won't allow a private business to do that. That's absurd, and we should all be ashamed.
Commissioner Preston.
I just want to make a couple of comments, and then I have a question. I guess we can't make, in my mind, we cannot make assumptions about Mid-America Steel getting developed. If there happens to be brownfields issue or any other kind of land issue that a developer would have to deal with, they have to see an ROI on the development. So it's no guarantee that it's going to happen without some additional assistance. Secondly, I keep going back to the purpose of TIF, which is to level the playing field between redevelopment of an existing site where the infrastructure is already in place, the city has minimal cost or risk in bringing infrastructure to that site versus something out in the green fields. Now, one thing I do agree with you is the ROI issue. And I know that we're embarking on a study with Baker Tilly. Kent, can you give us an update where that, I'm assuming that would give us some kind of framework to evaluate projects.
Yeah, the Baker Tilly project, we have scoped that and it has been approved. We haven't started the project yet, just due to the COVID impacts and the availability of staff and others. But The idea behind this study was simply to try to measure the ROI in targeted areas or larger development areas. I don't know that it's been tuned down to site-specific TIF-type activities in the downtown. It's more generic with regard to you get out into the fringe and you start developing from the start. What's the impact of that? But to give you a status, it's on hold right now. It has not started.
So Kent, it will not give us some kind of framework to evaluate projects on? I mean, is it going to be specific to just the one that we're embarking on it for, or?
Well, it will be an analytical tool that will help us to measure the ROI, but the scope of it, because we haven't started the project yet, I'm not sure exactly how it's going to be
Okay,
done.
okay.
But I mean, whether you,
Well, I would look, and I agree fully. I think we need some tools in place to be able to do exactly what Tony is suggesting here, which is evaluating the ROI on projects in which we're involved. I think that would be a value. The third thing I was going to say, and this question is for you, Jim. This being a city-initiated type of TIF district, it seems like we have done that before. Was the Radisson one specifically a larger district to accomplish some larger public kind of goals, if I remember right?
I believe the Radisson was confined to that particular block, and then that debt was paid off. And again, I wasn't here when they, I can't remember if it paid for the Skyway or the parking, but it ended in 2007.
Okay.
The one that was a larger one was this with Island Park, was for the redevelopment of the Dakota Bank building, which is where Alaris is now, and the Wells Fargo building. That one was approved again in the early 80s. It was extended, I think, in about 1999. Actually, all the debt was paid off, and the city, rather than end the district, continued it and decided to build the Island Park ramp. So that's why that one wasn't planned to go that long. Right now, the state legislature only allows you to go 25 years. If you want to go longer, you have to do a reset back to like 15 years before. And so you really can't run these forever. The TIF notes, and that's where I said there's no risk on the TIF notes. There's certainly, when you borrow money, there's going to be some risk. On the TIF notes, you only have to pay those if you actually have the income. And by policy and our interpretation of state laws, you can't really go beyond 15 years on those.
Okay. One more question in regards to a comment earlier about selling property versus actually putting out RFPs. With each of these suggested projects that would be inside this TIF, I'm assuming we would have say or final approval on
Yes,
each one of the
that-
projects.
That would be my recommendation, is that we do an RFP on all of them, similar to what we did at 501 Main Avenue, that we sell contingent on the development happening. We did that with the Roberts property where the Kessler is. We actually had a lien that if they didn't do the development, then we could take the property back and sell it to someone who did. And I'd work with Eric Johnson to make sure that our RFP follows our city procedures. And that way you can set the standards and say, we want at least, this amount of development, and maybe we're only going to give this type of incentive. So maybe you say, oh, we'll only give the 5-year Renaissance zone. That's what we did with 501 Main Avenue. So the developers, in giving us a proposal, know exactly what incentive might be available, and so there's a level playing field.
So in this case, if we have this TIF district in place, the TIF is not going to be available to the private developer. You had indicated that maybe we wouldn't demolish the building. We would put that on the developer. That I don't quite understand.
Well, what I'm saying is you'll need to decide that as you sell each property. Are you going to give a 15-year exemption in order to get something done? Is that on the table, or is that off the table? You need to kind of lay that out up front. So we could give development incentives with TIF, and I think we need to continue to look at those project by project or we have our financial, reviewer take a look at these. And if the return on investment is just great without the incentive, then we don't offer it. If the developer says, I can't make money without the incentive, then we have a choice to make. Either we want the development or we don't.
Jim, when we talk about TIFs and pilots, it seems to me there's almost a 30 to 1 return on investment on a TIF, meaning that the value of the property goes up. So Block 9 was built and we were getting maybe $3,000 of taxes, and when our TIF is over on Block 9, we'll get $1 million in taxes. When downtown developed in the 1990s and has evolved to what it is, the property values downtown were 150 million. Now they're well over 600 million property values. Not all those properties got TIFs. It's the whole rising ship. As a rising tide, the ship rises, and what happened is the properties all downtown grow. Commissioner Gary comment, the taxes haven't gone down. Actually, the mill levy has gone down over the last 5 years. We've dropped the mill for the city several times over the last 6 years, and that has continued to happen. I think, Jim, at one time you also mentioned that because of the developments we have in the community, that actually taxes have been saved 4%.
Yeah, if the value of the downtown had stayed the same as it was in 1999, each of the taxing jurisdictions would have to tax at a rate 4% higher today in order to make that. So as the downtown pays more, everyone else pays less. And so we can debate what caused that, but.
And the city really doesn't have money that we invest. We don't take $2 or $3 million and invest it into development. The only way we can invest in the growth in the community is a TIF. And what happens is the same taxes are being paid, and we had on parking lots taxes of $4,000 paid for 20, 30 years. There was nothing going on in those places. Now with good TIF policy, we've been able to grow the community, and actually our property values in the community of Fargo are close to $20 billion. In that $20 billion, we have almost 52% commercial versus 48% residential. So a lot of the growth in the community has decreased residents' tax burden.
Yeah, we're fortunate to have a large commercial tax base. I mean, our mill levy is 50 something, in West Fargo it's 70 something. That's because we have a lot of apartments and commercial that pay property taxes.
And then finally, what we want really in the downtown TIFs is the ability to do public entities. So if we want to get the plaza done in front of City Hall or do some public work issues around the community around City Hall, the ability with the TIF is to do that without causing increasing taxes to the community. It actually helps us to fund different things that we may want to do in the downtown area around City Hall, and or do something with the Civic Center, and or do something with the performing arts. So the advantage of the TIF is to go from the growth and development around us that happens around us. And perfectly logical in many big cities, when we did the downtown focus study, that's in fact what came out of that. And it's another way of doing something other than causing a tax to your downtown development or what's going on.
Yeah, that's the strategy other cities have. You enhance your public amenities, and then that attracts development, attracts more development than you would otherwise have.
Mr. Preston.
If I could just make a comment, there's a lot of talk here about growth and how that has allowed us to decrease or maintain a stable mill levy. But we also need to keep in mind the maintenance issues that are happening as growth happens. And that's why I'm interested in this ROI study, is to figure out what are the long-term maintenance issues, and that's been brought up with the parking ramps. And how does that fold into the long-term financial picture? Yes, by all means, property tax values have gone up because of the development. Excuse me. But what we're not taking into account real well are the maintenance issues, and I'm talking 40, 50 years down the road. I do believe we need that piece of information that we don't have currently. And I would really like to see that prior to embarking on any big projects.
Mr. Gary.
When you talk about the 30 to 1, that, again, the three main assumptions, and by the way, before 2017 or so, 66% of businesses downtown never received an incentive. So that growth happened without it. And the biggest increase in percentage was the first 5 years with the Renaissance Zone, not TIFs and pilots, What we did was we had to increase the incentives as the market adjusted to these incentives. That's what happens. It's called a bubble. As you increase the dollars put in by the government, at some point those dollars don't affect the market at the same rate as they did before because the market becomes used to it. They expect these dollars. And when the dollars aren't enough, as the values increase and it's more expensive to buy property and develop the property, well, we need more and more incentives, which is what you see happening. We have properties in Fargo right now that have a Renaissance zone, a TIF, and a pilot on top of them for, in some cases, 25 to 30 years, or a single incentive for 40 plus years. That's what happens. That's a bubble. And I don't want to see the bubble burst, which we've seen in the housing market, in the college debt market, all over this country. And we keep following that lead. A TIF is debt. That is the definition of a investment. When you go into debt to do these things, we take a loan out. For Kmart, for example, we're talking about $3 million. We're going to take a loan out. That is debt. That is an investment by the city. You can't say the city is not investing by not taking in property taxes. That's the opposite of what's happening. We literally take out a loan for real money with a real percentage attached to it to do that. All right, to your point about greenfields, we all do realize, right, that we do incentivize greenfields, right? We have assessments. I'll ask Mike, because you're the closest thing to engineering I can see right here, right now. What's our assessment debt in the city of Fargo? From my understanding, it's $500 million at this point. About more than half of that is greenfield at this point for assessments. So that's a dramatic amount of money we put into that. That's a debt the city holds. We hold a bond for that. We pay that when people pay their property taxes. If people can't pay their property taxes, guess who pays for it? Everyone else. That is a debt. That is an incentive. We have a new home abatement. We are talking about lobbying the state to go from $150,000 to $200,000 or more for the new home abatement. That is an incentive. So while we're incentivizing downtown and infill, and we're saying we need to do more and more, at the same time we're saying we need to also incentivize greenfield more and more. We need to have more assessments, and we need to raise the amount for the abatement for that. If you incentivize everything, are you really incentivizing anything? Why not just stop it and let the free market tell us where to grow? That sounds better to me. And I've had talks with Kilbourne Group, and they've told me that on-street parking is an incentive. Well, if you live in South Fargo, you can park on the street, right? Not like North Fargo. I live in North Fargo. Only one side of the street you can. Well, in South Fargo, you have these big, wide roads, right? And we assess people for that, city debt, and people can park there. So we are incentivizing greenfield. We are incentivizing infill. We're incentivizing basically everything at the expense of everybody else who's not getting the incentive, which is the normal homeowner who just wants to be left alone. I just want to pay my taxes, and I want to go to the park. Why do I keep getting hit with more and more assessments, more higher property taxes, and the school board can't afford to hire teachers because we're stealing their money? It's a dereliction of duty that the school board and the park board are not voting against these things. And then they have to raise their mills, and we all wonder why our taxes are going up. It's so simple. It's so in front of our face, and we're still getting this money out. And I don't understand it, and I am not excited about it. And I want people to be held accountable for people's property taxes going up year after year. When we say if we invest, we're getting 4% better rate. Well, my taxes just went up again and again and again. They've never gone down. And I wonder why.
Just to make a clarification on greenfields, it's 100% assessed to the homeowner. We did this special evaluation. Let me finish. And the second issue is we've not taken a position on the abatement issue. There is a bill in the legislature that would increase the limit from 150 to 250 and wants to go 5 years. And I believe, Jim, we've not taken a position as a city to oppose or to support that.
I believe the finance director sent in a letter in opposition to that.
So we have not, when you say we have not supported that.
Right, and the bill has been amended. It would no longer extend to 5 years, would stay at 2. And I think it may have already come out of committee with a do not pass, so I'll give you an update on that.
Any other discussion? Well, Jim, thanks for the information, and you have handouts for us?
Yeah, I've got a copy of the draft plan. It's kind of based on what I've shown you, and copies of the slides, and if anyone in the audience would want one too, I believe there's enough.
Thank you.